The first thing I heard when I walked into the gym wasn't good luck, it was a whisper. She doesn't even have an athlete's body. I felt their eyes, one by one, measuring me, tearing me apart from the inside. No one said my name. No one looked me in the eye. But they were all thinking the same thing. And when they called me to the vault, I walked forward with one thought in my mind. They were only there to watch me fail. What they didn't know was that this would be the last time they ever underestimated me. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not on this stage. Not under these lights. And definitely not wearing this uniform. From the very beginning, I was told I didn't belong. Not because I couldn't perform, but because of how I looked. My body wasn't right for gymnastics. My skin wasn't the shade they expected. My thighs were too thick, my arms too wide, my face too ordinary, and my background too poor to matter. They had a list of reasons why I'd never make it, and none of them had anything to do with talent. This isn't just a story about gymnastics. It's a story about being rejected before you even try. About being judged before you speak. About fighting for a space in a world that's already decided you don't fit. But I kept going. Not because I was fearless, but because every time they tried to shrink me, a part of me grew louder inside. In this video, you're going to see what happened when a girl with the wrong body stepped into the right moment. You're going to feel what it's like to be silenced, and then roar back. You'll understand what it means to carry pain in your spine and still land perfectly on your feet. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of this story, you'll believe a little more in your own. Because this isn't just my journey. It's for everyone who's ever been laughed at, pointed at, ignored, or underestimated. So if you're ready to feel something real, hit that subscribe button. If this story touches you, leave a like, it helps us reach more people who need it. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? City and country. I'd love to know how far this message travels. Now take a deep breath with me, ... Because this isn't going to be easy to relive, but I promise it's worth it. They never handed me a real mirror, but they didn't have to. The way they looked at me was enough to show me everything they thought I was. Too wide, too dark, too poor, and way too different to belong on a gymnastics floor. I learned early on that mirrors don't just reflect what you see, they reflect what the world thinks you should be. And what the world showed me wasn't pretty. I didn't grow up around medals, podiums, or girls with perfect buns and pastel leotards. I grew up around cracked tiles, clotheslines, and the smell of hot asphalt rising from under bare feet. Gymnastics wasn't even a dream. It was something I saw on an old TV in a neighbor's living room. But something inside me stirred every time I watched someone spin through the air. Not envy. Not fantasy. Hunger. That was the word. I felt hungry for flight. Hungry to feel what it was like to rise. When I told people I wanted to be a gymnast, they didn't laugh. They just stared. Like I'd said I wanted to touch the moon. Like it wasn't worth laughing at because it was too far from possible. That silence. It stuck to my skin more than any insult ever could. My first real encounter with a gym was almost accidental. A neighbor heard me mimicking flips in the backyard and told my mother about a free trial class at a community center. My mom didn't even hesitate. She tied my hair with a shoelace, gave me her tightest hug, and told me to go show the world what I was made of. But when I got there, it didn't matter what I was made of. It only mattered what I looked like. The other girls were already stretching identical bodies, identical uniforms, identical stares. I walked in wearing a t-shirt 3 sizes too big and shorts that didn't match, and I knew. I felt it. I was the wrong shape in a place built for symmetry. The coach didn't say much, just pointed at the mat and nodded. I tried to smile, but my chest was caving in. I was scared of being seen, but terrified of being invisible. The first jump I did was clumsy. Not because I lacked skill, but because I was holding back. Afraid to move wrong. Afraid to jiggle. Afraid to exist too loudly. And when I landed with a thud, instead of a bounce, I didn't hear encouragement. I heard whispers. Soft, subtle, but sharp. She's not flexible enough. She's gonna break something. Why is she even here? I went home that day with dust on my knees and shame in my throat. I didn't say a word at dinner. I just stared into the plate like it was a mirror. I saw a girl who had no place in the world she wanted to live in. I wanted to quit. I wanted to disappear. But then, my mother sat next to me. She didn't say don't cry. She didn't say you'll get better. She said, they see you as wrong because they've never seen someone like you get it right. And that sentence lit a fuse I didn't know I had. The next time I stepped into that gym, something had changed. Not in them, in me. I wasn't walking in to be accepted. I was walking in to train. To earn space, not ask for it. But that didn't mean they made it easy. Every glance still cut. Every silence still bruised. But I'd stopped looking for approval. I wasn't there to please anyone. I was there to learn how to fly. I started staying later than anyone, cleaning up the mats just to get 5 extra minutes alone. Watching YouTube videos on a borrowed phone, imitating movements over and over again in my room. I'd jump off chairs, land on pillows, tape my feet to feel what real grips might be like. My body wasn't broken. It was just different. And different doesn't mean incapable. It means undiscovered. And yet, every day, the mirror they gave me kept showing me doubt. They never said it directly, but I knew what they were thinking. She's not gymnast material. They thought I was too much of what I shouldn't be, and not enough of what I should. But I started to realize, their mirror was cracked. And I didn't have to keep looking into it forever. But what I didn't know was that the real test hadn't even started yet. What happens when you stop chasing approval and start chasing yourself? What if the first person you need to prove wrong is the one in the mirror? And what happens when someone finally sees what you've been hiding all along? I didn't have a leotard. Not the kind they wore. Mine wasn't sleek, or shiny, or branded. It didn't hug my body in all the right places. It clung to me like a secret I couldn't shake. The first time I wore it, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd feel like one of them, like a gymnast. But all it did was remind me of how far I still was. The fabric was borrowed. The color was faded. And it didn't matter how well I stretched, or how clean my landings were. The first thing they saw was always what I wore. Not how I moved, but how I looked in motion. And let me tell you something. When your body doesn't fit their mold, every move you make feels louder, heavier, riskier. The labels didn't come from tags. They came from eyes. From the way they looked at me and then looked away. From how they'd whisper when I passed. From the coach who said nothing, which somehow said everything. And slowly, I started carrying those labels inside me. Too bulky, too masculine, too poor, too street. I wore them tighter than my leotard. There was this girl, small, quiet, She never spoke to me, but she stared like she was cataloging everything I did wrong. One day, after practice, I overheard her saying, "She's strong, but she's not, gymnastic." Whatever that meant. I went home that night and stood in front of the mirror, twisting and turning. Trying to figure out what part of me didn't fit the word. But the worst part wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't. No one told me how to improve. No one corrected my form. I was there physically, but I wasn't part of the equation. I was a shadow on the mat. Present but peripheral. I remember the first time I got the courage to ask the coach for feedback. He looked surprised, like he hadn't even realized I was still in the group. He nodded, gave me 2 generic tips, then walked away mid-sentence to correct another girl's posture. That moment, it burned. I started questioning everything. Was I pushing too hard? Was I embarrassing myself? Was I fighting for a spot in a world that didn't even want me as a background extra? One afternoon, after a rough practice, I sat on the locker room bench holding my leotard in my lap like it was made of glass. It was wrinkled, stretched, faded, just like how I felt. I remember whispering to myself, maybe they're right. That's all I said. But that whisper echoed louder than any cheer I'd ever heard. And yet, for some reason, I didn't quit. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. But part of me couldn't let go of the thought that somewhere deep down, I belonged here. Not because of how I looked, but because of how I felt when I moved. That moment between takeoff and landing. That fraction of a second when the world held its breath. That was mine. And nobody could take that from me. So I started making changes. Not in my body, in my mind. I stopped waiting for validation. I started filming myself during training to coach my own technique. I wrote notes, tracked progress, studied the way champions moved. If no one was going to teach me, I'd teach myself. If no one clapped for me, I'd learn to land in silence. Still, I was invisible at competitions. Always placed in the back. Never introduced with excitement. Never called last in the lineup. But when I stuck a landing, and I mean stuck it, I looked right into the crowd. Not for approval, but to remind them, you saw that, even if you pretend you didn't. And that's when I began to notice something shift. A few claps, a few eyes lingering. Nothing big. But in a world built to erase girls like me, even a glance felt like a revolution. I wasn't there to wear their labels anymore. I was there to rewrite mine. But I had no idea that just as I was finding my rhythm, the ground beneath me was about to collapse. What happens when the silence finally breaks? But not in the way you expect. What do you do when the moment you've worked for doesn't go the way you imagined? And how do you keep moving forward when the fall isn't just physical? It's personal. It was the way they said it that stayed with me. Not loud, not angry, just casual, like it was a fact written somewhere in a rulebook I'd never seen. She's not the type we're looking for. That sentence, I wasn't even supposed to hear it, but I did. And once you hear something like that, it never unhears itself. It happened during my first real competition outside the community center. I had qualified on merit. I knew that. My scores were solid. Not perfect, but consistent. But when I got there, something felt off. The looks were longer. The silences were colder. And the smiles, if they appeared at all, were tight, rehearsed, and painfully fake. I was the only girl warming up on the side with no matching gear. Everyone else had coordinated team outfits, personalized warm-ups, spotless equipment bags. I was wearing a second-hand jacket with a hole in the elbow, and shoes with the soles taped. And it was like that tape was screaming louder than I ever could. While stretching, I overheard two judges speaking just a few feet away. One of them said, "She's strong, but she's not our type." The other nodded and added, "Yeah, it's not just about scores, it's about image." Image. So it didn't matter how much I trained. It didn't matter how high I jumped, how clean I landed, how focused I was. If I didn't fit the image, I didn't belong. That day, I performed like my life depended on it. Every flip was powered by frustration. Every landing pressed deep into the floor like I was trying to leave a scar. And when I finished, I looked straight at the judges. I didn't smile. I didn't bow. I stared. I wanted them to see me. All of me. The parts they tried to filter out, but when the scores came in, I dropped. Lower than expected. Lower than I deserved. The numbers didn't match my execution. Not even close. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the phrases in my head. Not her type, image. And for the first time, I started wondering if they were right. Maybe I really didn't belong here. Maybe I was just a good imitation of a gymnast, not the real thing. But something inside me wouldn't let that be the end. I remembered all the girls I never saw represented. The ones who didn't have the gear, or the body, or the sponsorships, but still had the fire. Where were they? Why weren't they up there with me? Maybe they heard the same words I did, and decided to walk away. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I'd already bled for this. I started researching past athletes who broke molds. Watched footage of women who changed the sport by refusing to shrink. I saw bodies like mine, powerful, grounded, unshakable, doing things no one expected. And I realized, it wasn't that I was the wrong type. It was that their definition was too small. From that day forward, I trained not to be one of them, but to become the best version of me. I stopped trying to copy the grace of girls who'd never walked a mile in my shoes. I embraced the way my body moved, explosive, fluid, grounded. I built routines that fit me, not some mold printed in a magazine. I started drawing attention, but not always the good kind. Coaches would watch my routines with narrowed eyes. Some gave vague compliments, others avoided me altogether. I wasn't being groomed for greatness. I was tolerated, just enough to not be excluded. One coach even said to my face, "You're impressive, but you're going to need to soften your style. Judges want elegance, not aggression." I smiled politely, and then trained even harder the next day. Still, I could feel something brewing, something under the surface. A tension, a sense that I was either going to break through, or be broken entirely. Because the truth was, I could handle the stares. I could handle the whispers. But I wasn't prepared for what came next, when my body finally started pushing back. What happens when your biggest obstacle isn't the judges, but your own strength? What do you do when the system won't bend, and your body begins to crack? And how far can you go before the weight of silence becomes louder than applause? I stopped expecting applause. I stopped expecting encouragement, correction, recognition, or even eye contact. I realized that if I was going to rise, it wouldn't be through the front door. I'd have to crawl through the basement, climb through the pipes, and build my own damn ladder. That's how it works when you're not the favorite. When you're not the type. When you're just the girl in the back, silent, invisible, and stubborn enough to stay. So I trained in silence. I showed up earlier than everyone else. sometimes before the lights were even on. The custodian would let me in without a word, just a nod, like he understood what I was chasing. I stayed after hours, long after the others had already posted their selfies and gone home to ice baths and protein shakes. I didn't have a nutritionist. I didn't have a personal trainer. I didn't even have proper chalk. But I had repetition. And repetition, when done with obsession, becomes a kind of war cry. My body ached in ways I can't explain. My joints cracked like old floorboards. My wrists swelled from bad landings. I taped my fingers with masking tape because athletic tape was too expensive. I trained on mats that were already worn thin from years of better funded feet. But every drop of sweat was mine. Every inch I gained was carved from my own refusal to stop. At home, I flipped off couches, practiced balance on the edges of bricks in the backyard, hung from door frames until my arms shook. I had no sponsors, no spotlight, no equipment, but I had obsession, and when you're denied a stage, you turn your pain into choreography. I studied routines online, pausing each movement, breaking it down frame by frame. I mimicked champions in the dark. I trained until the room spun. I landed on concrete more times than I care to count, and I kept going. There were nights my legs refused to move. I'd collapse on the mattress and stare at the ceiling, wondering if this was all just madness. No one was watching. No one was praising me. No one was posting my progress. So why keep going? Because I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for the girl who was told she was too ugly to be seen. For the girl who got lower scores because her leotard didn't match. For the girl who heard not your type and stayed anyway. I was doing it for her. For me. But even with all that determination, I wasn't immune to doubt. One evening, after a brutal solo training session, I looked at myself in the cracked mirror of our bathroom. My hair was soaked with sweat. My shins were bruised. My arms looked heavier than they should. I whispered, maybe they're right, just once, and hated myself for it immediately. That sentence was a poison, and I had let it in. I needed a break. But the world doesn't pause for your pain. And I couldn't afford to stop. Every time I skipped one day, someone else got ahead. Someone with the right look. Someone with better shoes. Someone with approval I had never tasted. I trained until the hunger in my stomach mixed with the hunger in my chest. Until the pain became part of the rhythm. I no longer feared being ignored. I feared being noticed and forgotten just as fast. Then something strange started to happen. I began hitting my marks more consistently. I started landing with precision. My stamina increased. I began flowing instead of forcing. And though no one said it, I could feel it. Some of the coaches started watching from the corners. The girls stopped giggling. Some even began stretching near me, stealing glances at my forms, my repetitions. I wasn't part of the team, but I had become part of the silence. They couldn't deny I was there anymore. I had carved space with grit, not grace. But nothing had prepared me for what came next. Because just as I started to climb out of the shadows, life reminded me where I came from and how fast it can all fall apart. What happens when your body finally says enough? But your soul refuses to stop. What do you do when life doesn't just test your will, it tries to erase your path? And how do you rise again when everything you've built begins to crumble beneath you? I remember the day I walked back into that gym like it happened 5 minutes ago. The smell of sweat and chalk. The squeak of rubber soles on polished floor. The thud of feet landing harder than they should. I had left that place nearly invisible. The girl with no voice, no shine, and no approval. But I wasn't that girl anymore. Something had shifted. My body hadn't magically changed. My skin was still too dark for their marketing banners. My thighs were still thick with muscle. But my presence had weight now. And when I walked in, people noticed. Not because I demanded it, but because the energy around me was different. My walk had rhythm. My silence had purpose. My movements were sharper, more intentional. I wasn't training to fit in anymore. I was training to dominate. I had grown in the shadows, built myself brick by brick behind their backs. And now I was standing in front of them again, not asking for permission, but ready to take what was mine. Some of the girls greeted me with cautious smiles, as if trying to remember if they'd ever actually spoken to me. The coaches, on the other hand, didn't know what to do. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered a forced good to have you back, but I could see it in their eyes. Curiosity. They were trying to measure me all over again. Only now, I wouldn't stand still long enough for them to finish. That first practice back, I moved like I had something to prove, but only to myself. My leaps were higher, my spins tighter. My landings no longer collapsed, they echoed, and each time I stuck one, I saw the heads turning. They weren't used to girls like me making noise for the right reasons. By the end of the session, one of the assistant coaches pulled me aside. He said, "You've improved. A lot." I waited for the but. There's always a but. But this time, it didn't come. Just a nod, and a look that said, "We see you now." And honestly, that was enough for me. But the thing about being noticed is that it comes with a price. Now they were watching. Every move, every angle. Not always in admiration, sometimes in disbelief. Sometimes in doubt. Like they were waiting for me to mess up so they could go back to ignoring me. And that kind of pressure isn't quiet. It wraps around your throat and tightens just when you're about to breathe. The competitions started rolling in. Smaller ones at first, then regional. I showed up alone most of the time. No entourage. No coach in my corner. Just me, my beat-up bag, and a playlist in my head that reminded me who I was doing this for. And still, I was never the favorite. Never the one the announcer said with excitement. Never the name printed in bold on the list. But I didn't need that, because I had something none of them could fake. Hunger. Real hunger. The kind that doesn't care about cameras or sponsorships. The kind that comes from being told no since the moment you said I will. Then came the event that changed everything. It was a large invitational, packed with scouts, coaches, press. The gym buzzed with electricity. And there I was, lane 3, third rotation, barely mentioned by name. I stood backstage, waiting for my turn. And that's when I heard it again, not a whisper this time. A clear voice, someone in the crowd. "Oh, it's that girl again. The one who's too thick for this." A laugh followed, but something inside me had changed since the last time I heard words like that. I didn't flinch, I didn't blink, I smiled. Because I knew what was coming. When they called my name, I walked onto the floor with the calm of a storm that's been building for years. My feet were steady, my breathing slow, every muscle in my body was in tune. I took my position, raised my chin, and let them watch. And when I jumped, I didn't just land. I arrived. But what happens when arrival comes with consequences no one warned you about? What do you do when recognition finally comes, but brings resentment with it? And what if being seen wasn't the end of the fight, but just the beginning? They say every gymnast falls. It's part of the journey. You fall, you get back up. Again and again. It's how we're trained. Muscle memory. Mental toughness. But no one tells you what happens when the fall isn't just physical, when it tears into something deeper. Your pride, your image, your identity. That fall. Echoes, and mine. It was louder than anything I'd ever heard. It happened during the biggest event I had ever qualified for. After everything I'd gone through, the rejection, the whispers, the invisible years in the shadows, I was finally there. On the same floor as the best, under the same lights. Wearing the same number on my back. But still, not really seen. I could feel it, even in the warm-up area. The other athletes smiled at each other, hugged, wished luck, but when I passed by, it was like I didn't exist. A few sideways glances, a few eyebrows raised, and then, nothing. Like I was just passing through a world that didn't have a space carved for me. But I didn't care. Or at least, I told myself I didn't. I had one event to prove I belonged there. Just one, the vault. And I had practiced that routine so many times I could feel the steps in my bones. I had it. I knew I had it. The room fell silent as I stepped into position. My heart pounded, but my body was still. I focused on the path ahead. Ran, jumped, hit the springboard with everything I had. For a moment, I was flying, and then everything went wrong. I overloaded, my hand placement slipped. My leg didn't tuck the way it should have, and I fell. Hard. The mat caught me, but it didn't protect me. Not from the gasp in the crowd. Not from the sound of my coach muttering "damn" under his breath. Not from the judge who slowly lowered her pen. Not from the silence that followed, the kind that doesn't come from respect, but from pity. I laid there for a second too long. Not because I was hurt, but because something inside me cracked. Not my bones. My belief. All I could hear was the voice that once whispered, "She's not our type." And in that moment, I believed it. When I finally stood, the applause was hesitant, scattered, sympathetic, and I hated it. I would have preferred silence. They didn't see a fighter who fell. They saw a girl who confirmed their doubts. I walked off the floor, trying not to cry. But when I reached the locker room, the tears came fast, silent and uncontrollable. I pulled off my leotard like it was made of thorns. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. Not because of the fall, but because of what it triggered in me. That old voice. That old fear. The one that told me I was never going to be enough. No matter how much I trained. No matter how clean I landed, because I didn't look the part. After that day, things changed. Coaches stopped calling me in for events. My name was removed from the shortlist for regionals. I was told I should rest, should regroup, should think about my next steps. But none of them were really suggestions. They were coded exits, invitations to disappear. I isolated myself. Stopped showing up early, skipped training sessions. I stayed in bed longer. I felt hollow. The worst part, I started to believe I had peaked. That maybe I had been wrong all along. Maybe this wasn't my world to fight for. But then something happened. A package arrived at my house. No name on it. Just my address. Inside, a handwritten letter. No signature, no return. Just one sentence. They laughed at me too. Folded inside the note was a photo, an old black and white picture of a woman mid-air. Mid-twist, caught in a perfect moment of flight. Strong thighs, broad shoulders. Nothing like the girls they put in magazine covers today. But she looked glorious. I don't know who sent it, but it woke something in me. It reminded me that I wasn't alone. That I came from somewhere. That there were others who were told they weren't right, and still made history anyway. And I couldn't let one fall become my ending. Not like this. What if the fall wasn't the end, but the beginning of something deeper? What if someone, somewhere, was still watching, waiting for me to rise again? And what happens when your silence becomes your loudest answer? While they whispered that I'd disappeared, I was busy reappearing in ways they couldn't imagine. I stopped going to the usual practices, stopped standing in the same corner waiting for attention that never came, and they thought I had finally given up. That maybe the fall broke me. That maybe I realized I'd never be one of them. They didn't know I was working harder than ever, just not where they could see. I went underground. Not literally, but emotionally. Spiritually. I trained in places no coach would bother looking. Parking lots, school hallways, rooftops at dusk. I rebuilt myself in pieces. Away from the noise, away from the mirrors, away from the eyes that only ever scanned for flaws. I stopped chasing perfection and started chasing truth, the kind of truth you can only earn with blood, grit, and silence. I found an old gym no one talked about anymore. It had warped floors, peeling paint, no heating. But it had space. It had solitude. And it had echoes that didn't judge, only answered. I trained there before sunrise, my breath visible in the cold air, my body remembering what flight felt like. No cameras. No spotlights. Just me and the sound of muscle reconnecting with purpose. I started designing my own routines. Not the kind that scored well, but the kind that told stories. I blended power and grace. Took risks they told me never to take. Made movements explode with emotion, not just technique. I stopped performing like I was being watched. I started moving like I was free. I watched myself through a cracked phone screen, recording every session. I critiqued my own landings, adjusted my steps, timed my breath. I wasn't just an athlete anymore, I was my own coach, my own choreographer, my own motivator. I wasn't polishing what they wanted to see. I was building what I needed to become. People love to talk about talent. But talent is overrated. Discipline. That's where the miracles happen. When no one is clapping. When no one even knows you're there. When you train not for validation, but for vengeance, not to hurt others, but to heal yourself. The nights were the worst. After training, my body would scream. My knees throbbed. My fingers bled. My spine ached. And still, I'd do one more run. One more stretch. One more leap in the dark. Because I knew what was coming, I could feel it. Something was shifting. I wasn't just improving, I was transforming. And while I was invisible to them, something strange began to happen. A message, then another. Quiet ones. From girls I didn't know. I saw what you did at that last meet. You were incredible. I'm built like you. And seeing you gave me hope. Thank you for not quitting. I didn't know they were watching. But they were. And now I wasn't just training for me. I was training for them. For every girl who was told she didn't look the part. For every girl with wide hips, dark skin, strong arms, and a story no judge would ever ask about, I was training to show them what strength really looked like. Then came the call. A small competition, local, nothing fancy. But a chance. A real chance. They needed a last-minute replacement. I didn't hesitate. I packed my bag, tied my shoes, and showed up like I never left. The same people were there. The same faces. Same tension in the air. But I wasn't the same. I walked in with fire under my skin. With a calm that came from surviving the fall. And when they saw me, they blinked, like they weren't sure if I was real. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I took my place. And when the music started, I didn't perform. I told a story. What if your best performance isn't the one they expect, but the one they can't explain? What happens when silence turns into thunder? And they still pretend not to hear it. And what do you do when your body moves like truth, but the system still wants to lie? There's a kind of silence that isn't quiet at all. It hums under your skin. It weighs down your breath. It fills the space between your heartbeat and your doubt. That's the silence I felt standing at the edge of the runway, just seconds before I jumped. The gym was packed. The lights hotter than usual. The audience loud just moments before, now suddenly hushed, not out of respect, but anticipation. That hush you feel before a car crash. Before a mistake. Before something uncomfortable happens. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't even a threat. I was the curiosity. The anomaly. The girl who shouldn't still be trying. And they were all watching. I could feel every gaze crawling across my body, dissecting me piece by piece. My thighs, my posture, the way I adjusted my wristbands, the way I breathed. I wasn't stepping onto the floor to compete. I was stepping into a courtroom. And they were ready to deliver their verdict. But in that moment, I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because that silence, the one that used to make me want to disappear, now made me feel alive. That silence meant they were paying attention. And if they were going to watch, I was going to give them something they'd never forget. I closed my eyes. I didn't hear the crowd. I didn't hear the announcer. I heard my own breath. I heard my feet pushing against the floor one last time in my head. I heard my mother's voice whispering, "Make it yours," and I ran. Each step thundered through my body like a drumbeat. My legs coiled, exploded, launched me forward like a weapon. The springboard met me like it had been waiting for this moment. My body twisted, arched, reached for something higher than execution. It reached for release. For redemption. And for the first time in my life, I didn't overthink, I just moved. Mid-air, everything slowed down. I remembered every fall, every whisper, every bruise hidden under sleeves. Every night I trained in secret. Every voice that said, "She'll never make it." They were all with me, wrapped around my spine, pushing me forward. And then I landed. Perfectly. Not good. Not decent. Perfectly. The mat barely moved beneath me. My heels didn't shake. My arms rose, not in celebration, but in declaration. That moment wasn't about scorecards or approval. It was about proof. And the silence that followed was deafening. No one clapped at first. They didn't know what to do, like they had witnessed something real and didn't know how to process it. Then a single hand, a second, a third, and suddenly the room erupted. But I didn't smile. Not yet. Because I wasn't done. My routine continued, each movement sharper, fuller, more precise than the last. Every breath I took felt like it was carving space in a world that had tried to keep me out. Every motion spoke. Every step screamed. I didn't dance for them. I danced through them. And when the music faded, and I hit my final pose, the applause didn't come right away again. But when it did, it was louder than anything I'd ever heard. Still, part of me didn't trust it. Part of me waited for someone to say it wasn't enough. That I looked out of place. That it was a fluke. That I was powerful, but not elegant. Explosive, but not refined. The usual coded ways of saying, "You still don't belong here." But no one said anything. They just looked. And that was new. I walked off the floor slowly. My chest heavy, but not from exhaustion. From release. From the years I had swallowed pain without spitting it back out. From the silence I had turned into thunder. And then, just as I reached the edge of the arena, I saw her. A little girl in the front row. Brown skin, hair like mine, big eyes, holding her breath like she'd just witnessed something holy. And in that instant, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. What if the loudest applause isn't from the crowd, but from the little girl who finally sees herself in you? What do you do when the very place that broke you starts to echo your name? And what happens when the world finally looks at you and doesn't look away? I used to flinch when they called my name. Not because I was nervous, but because they always got it wrong. Mispronounced, mumbled, skipped over. As if saying it right would somehow mean acknowledging I deserved to be there. It wasn't just a name, it was my identity. And every time they butchered it, it felt like a quiet way of saying, you still don't belong. But not this time. This time, when the announcer cleared his throat before my routine, I felt the pause, the hesitation, and then, clarity. Precision. Like he had practiced. Like someone had corrected him. Like my name finally mattered enough to get it right. And when I heard it echo across the arena, full, clean, unmistakable, I didn't smile. But I felt it a shift. A crack in the wall that had kept me on the outside for so long. I walked onto the floor, not with pride, but with presence. I wasn't a guest anymore. I wasn't a footnote. I was a chapter. And I was about to write it myself. The routine was clean. Not just technically, emotionally. Every movement carried weight. Not because I was trying to impress them, but because I finally understood the power of being unapologetically myself. I wasn't moving like a gymnast who wanted a score. I was moving like a woman who had something to say, and this was the only language they couldn't ignore. When it ended, there was no polite clapping. There was eruption. Not the kind reserved for favorites. Not automatic applause. This was real. Delayed, shocked, loud. Like they didn't expect to feel what they just felt. And then came something even more unexpected. A journalist, one of the ones who had once written about a promising athlete with unorthodox style, approached me. He asked if he could do a feature. Not because of the score. Not because of the ranking, but because, in his words, you've changed something. I didn't say yes right away. I let the silence sit between us. Let him feel what it's like to wait for approval. Then I nodded, and walked away. After that meet, my name started to appear in places it never had. Websites, articles, comment sections. And every time I saw it, spelled correctly, said with confidence. I remembered the girl who used to write it in notebooks and dream about it being called on the loudspeakers. I got messages from girls I'd never met. From coaches I'd never trained with. From strangers around the world. Some thanked me. Others told me their own stories of being left out, labeled wrong, dismissed before they could even try. I read every single one, and I cried more reading those messages than I ever cried after a fall, because I realized, I wasn't just breaking through for me. I had become something I never expected. Proof. Proof that you can show up without the right body, and still be brilliant. Proof that you don't have to be their definition of graceful to be unforgettable. Proof that what they call different is sometimes just undeniable. The next few weeks felt like a dream I wasn't sure I was allowed to have. I started getting invites. My routines were shared online. Coaches who once ignored me now, nodded with a kind of quiet respect. Even the girls who used to whisper started asking for help with their technique. But recognition comes with weight. Now they were watching everything. Every step, every breath, and every mistake would be magnified. I knew I couldn't afford to slip. So I trained harder. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Because now it wasn't just about me. It was about every girl who had been told she wasn't their type. Every girl who never got her name said right. And still, a part of me waited for the catch. For the moment it would all be taken back. For the silence to return. Because when you've lived in the margins long enough, even celebration feels temporary. But then something happened. I got selected for something bigger. Something I hadn't even dared to dream about before. And as I read the official email, with my name written in bold at the top, spelled perfectly, centered proudly, I knew I had arrived. Not because they finally accepted me, but because I no longer needed them to. What if being seen was never the goal, but becoming impossible to ignore? What happens when the girl they tried to erase becomes the name everyone remembers? And what do you do when the stage gets even bigger, and so does the pressure to prove it wasn't a fluke? They say pressure makes diamonds. But no one talks about what it does before that. How it suffocates, bends, and nearly breaks you. How it fills your lungs with doubt. How it crawls under your skin, turning every breath into a negotiation with your past. I carried that pressure with me all the way to the biggest stage of my life. It wasn't just a competition. It was the moment. The place where everything I'd ever fought for would either erupt into glory or dissolve into silence. I had waited for this my whole life. Trained in shadows. Bled behind closed doors. Fell in front of crowds who didn't care. And now I stood under the spotlight, finally, but with the weight of 1,000 unspoken things pressing against my chest. This wasn't just about gymnastics anymore. It was about proving that the body they called wrong was capable of something undeniable. It was about the girls watching in the stands. And the ones watching from living rooms, school gyms, hospital beds, broken homes. It was about honoring the pain I had carried for so long, not to be pitied, but to be witnessed. Backstage, I sat alone. My coach paced. My teammates stretched. But I was somewhere else. Quiet, focused, listening to the old echoes, the ones that used to scare me. They didn't anymore, because I finally understood something. The weight wasn't holding me back. It was anchoring me, giving me something real to push against. Something to transform. I stepped onto the floor without flinching. The lights didn't blind me, they felt like fire. And I walked right into them. The judges looked up. Still, stern, familiar faces, same old glances. But this time, I didn't shrink. I lifted my chin, rolled my shoulders back, and let the silence swallow the room. Then I moved. And I didn't just perform. I told the story of every scar on my body. Every fall. Every insult muttered behind clipboards. Every time someone said, "She doesn't have the look." This was the look now. Power, control, beauty born from defiance. Each flip, each twist, each landing came with the sound of something breaking, not in me, but in them. In their expectations. In their standards. In the mold they had tried to pour me into. I stuck the final move like I had been born for that exact second. And when I raised my arms, the crowd didn't just cheer. They roared. Some cried. Some stood. Some just sat, stunned, as if they'd just witnessed the rewriting of something ancient. I walked off the floor lighter than I'd ever felt. The weight I carried for so long. It wasn't gone, but it had changed. It wasn't pain anymore. It was power. When the scores came in, the arena erupted again. But I didn't look at the scoreboard. I didn't care. That number didn't define me anymore. What mattered was that I had turned every no into fuel. That I had taken every insult and built a foundation under my feet. That I had shown the world, and myself, that I didn't need to fit their standards to exceed them. And when they handed me the medal, heavy, cold, real, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because I had one, but because I had finished something that once tried to finish me. The reporters asked questions. The cameras surrounded me. Flash after flash. Microphones everywhere. How does it feel to prove everyone wrong? I smiled. Not because I had proven them wrong, but because I had finally proven myself right. Back at the hotel, hours later, I opened my phone. Hundreds of messages. Thousands. But one stopped me cold. A picture, a little girl, wearing a leotard that looked just like mine, hair like mine, smile like mine. And the caption said, "Now I know I can." I broke down. Because in that moment, I understood the real victory. It wasn't gold, it wasn't scores. It was legacy. It was changing what people see when they look at a girl like me. It was the quiet revolution of representation. And it had begun. What if the heaviest weight wasn't something to drop, but something to transform? What do you do when your pain becomes someone else's permission to dream? And what happens when you realize you were never too much, they were just too small? Maybe they'll never admit how wrong they were. Maybe they'll never say it to my face, how they laughed, judged, excluded, measured me against a standard that was never made for girls like me. And that's okay. Because I didn't do it for their applause. I did it for the little girl inside me. The one who almost stopped believing she had the right to take up space. And I did it for every girl watching now. The ones still being told to shrink, to change, to wait their turn. Here's the truth. You don't need to be perfect to be powerful. You don't need to fit their mold to make history. You just need to be willing to rise, again and again, until your silence becomes a story they can't ignore. And one day when they finally say your name right, it won't be for what you look like. It'll be for who you dared to become. And if this story hits something deep inside you, if it reminded you of your own battles, or someone you love, don't leave without doing 3 things. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube this story matters. Subscribe to the channel because this is just the beginning. And go to the pinned comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. City, country, we want to see how far this message travels. Your story matters. Now let's make sure the world hears it.